Very good evening to everyone, and a big welcome to you all. Tonight, Michael Pollak is going to be leading our review of the Nine by Gwen Strauss. As we'll hear, it's about 9 women who are resistance fighters, and with what's going on right now in terms of Russian invasion of Ukraine and the resistance and the fighting that's going on, in a sense, it couldn't be more relevant. My brief summary ahead of Michael's review and our discussion to follow is that the Nine follows the true story of the author Gwen Strauss's aunt, who led a band of 9 female resistance fighters as they escaped a German forced labor camp. They were all under 30 when they joined the resistance. They smuggled arms through Europe, harbored parachuting agents, hid Jewish children, and much more. They were arrested by French police, interrogated and tortured by the Gestapo, and by the time they were enslaved at the labor camp in Leipzig, they were a close-knit group of friends. During the final days of the war, forced onto a death march, the 9 chose their moment and made a daring escape. The 9, like so many women in the resistance, kept quiet about their actions during the war. They weren't recognized as heroes. They didn't tell their stories. Gwen Strauss puts that right, and in this book, pieces together the story of these incredible women. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Simon and Sophie. Thank you for inviting me once more to lead the discussion on what is, again, a really interesting book. And could I just start off by saying that this book does scratch a certain itch that I always have, and I think I need to declare my prejudices up front. And I think my concern, and it's a concern about my inner soul as much as any truth out there, is that I'm always very proprietal about Holocaust and Holocaust stories. It's a sort of, whose Holocaust is it anyhow? And I react badly, wrongly, but badly, to books that say that the Holocaust isn't just a story about Jews. And here is a story not about Jews particularly, which falls within part of the canon of Holocaust literature. And I want to talk about that as we go through the book. How is this a book about the Second World War, or is this a book about the Holocaust? And I think there's a difference in how we approach it according to which bookshelf we put it on. And I was particularly thinking about this issue in the context of a certain aspect of the reportage in Israel of the Ukrainian situation. And hopefully none of you waste your time reading Orthodox blogs written in Israel, but for the occasional few of you who do waste your time, like me, reading that particular type of literature, you'll come across sort of a horrific, but nevertheless pervasive idea that the Ukrainian people were and are anti-Semitic, and we shouldn't fall over ourselves to support them because of their role in the Second World War and in the Shoah in particular. And obviously we would kick back against that. That seems a horrific proposition, although I assure you I've seen it in a number of places. And even in the sort of Orthodox print media. So obviously we would say that to make a nation guilty of something, because even a large number of individuals were anti-Semitic at a particular time, is a nonsense. And the story of their nation is not the story of the Holocaust, and therefore has nothing to do with their national struggle at the moment against the Russians. And if you forgive me, my day job is I'm a rabbi, so I'm going to fall back on my day job for half a moment and remind you that this Shabbat is the Shabbat that we remember the crimes of the Amalekite nations. And you may have thought that that supports this worldview that nations are responsible for their histories, which I'm saying is current in certain areas. But it's very interesting to note that the more responsible rabbinic sources point out that it's not the Amalekite nation we're interested in, it's the Amalekite idea that we're interested in. And we recall the idea, and wherever we can say we find that idea, that is the area that we need to focus our thinking on. So similarly, it seems to me that obviously then in the fact that there has been a history of Ukrainian anti-Semitism says nothing to the nature of the Ukrainian people, and we fight anti-Semitism as the idea and not the descendants of that particular of those people. And so if I'm saying that the history of mankind is not to be organized through nations, but is to be organized through ideas, then I've got to open up the Shoah, both sides of the story, both the perpetrators and the victims, and say it's not a remarkable and unique experience of nations. There can be Jewish victims, and equally valid, there can be non-Jewish victims, there can be German perpetrators, and there can be all sorts of other perpetrators. So I think I know somewhere that is the correct understanding of the Holocaust. It's not our Holocaust. We took the brunt of it, but it's part of an idea of racism and savagery that all humans are prone to at many times in history, and it's not a uniquely Jewish story. And if I sort of run the risk of aggravating the audience even further, I think in the UK at the moment, we're particularly fascinated by the amount of anti-Semitism there is, as if anti-Semitism is the only expression of racism and by far the worst expression of racism. That's just simply not true. And you know, if you read your Jewish Chronicle, sort of normally up to page 12 are accounts of anti-Semitism written as if there is no other racism, and written as if these events are by far the worst of their kind. I think the message of Parshat Zachor is nations are almost irrelevant. It's ideas that any human being might well adopt and cause suffering to any other human being. So that's my rabbinic take on books that aren't necessarily about the Jewish Holocaust, but tell very powerful stories. So onto the book itself, I have to say that I did find the method of writing a little bit confusing, in that I don't think she ever allows herself long enough narrative to actually develop the characters. Maybe I didn't read it carefully enough, but had any of the women wandered into my lounge, I wouldn't have recognized them from their personality. I didn't really, I wasn't sufficiently invested in the personalities because the dipping into various, going from one time to another time, made it difficult. At the beginning, she unfortunately does her best to aggravate me even further, which is her relentless bit of an exaggeration, but her use of magpie connections to provide seriousness and relevance to the book. What do I mean by that? She veers off the narrative, which for me was aggravating. I wanted to know about these women. I thought the story is absolutely fantastic. I'd really like to be able to read 8 pages of narrative and pick up an idea of who these people were. And she determinedly decided not to do that. But instead, at the beginning, she's a sort of cultural name dropper. And the sort of cultural name dropping I presume, is to give the thing an importance and a significance and maybe even a profundity. So I don't know if you remember all the way back to page 12, there was a discussion about some mathematical formula that was written on the wall. And then we got to the person who was responsible for the mathematical problem, who was someone called Galois, and we're told that he died in a duel. We've now got quite a long way from the real story, and Galois dying in a duel, great, but I really want to. I want to know about Zaza, who and Helen, who are there and who are part of the story. But instead, we have to listen to Jules, and then she sort of turns into a sort of philosopher. She raises one of the issues in the philosophy of mathematics, whether our intellect limits our knowledge of mathematics, and then flips from there to something in the philosophy of language. Does our knowledge of language limit our understanding of the universe? And it's a sort of an affected profundity, I think. The book isn't about philosophy, and she's not a philosopher. The book isn't about great moments in dueling history. The book's about these presumably amazing women who I'd like to know more about, but I don't feel that she gives it to us. So this, what I'm calling sort of magpie connections, let's sort of, in two jumps, let's talk about something which isn't actually the story, but it lends importance to my book. So my book is now a book about philosophy and all sorts of things. I see something similar again on page 16, where she tries to connect the book, this time not to matters profound, but she tries to connect the book to the Jewish narrative. And because of the things I said at the beginning, I think that's unnecessary. And it's also, there isn't much connection. One of the women had a Jewish father, but they didn't know that at the time. And Nicole came from a Jewish family, but that wasn't part of the story because they weren't saying that to anyone at the time. So again, this sort of, it's a double-edged sword. She takes us away from the narrative, which is really annoying. And she introduces things which I think she thinks may lend importance and significance to the book. But the fact that 60 years later, they discovered that one of the people, one of the heroines was Jewish to an extent, even though they never professed it. I don't think that's a very, very helpful, and on the contrary, it's less than helpful. It actually draws us away from it. And I think she does the same thing when much later, during the story of the liberation, she keeps on referring to, she refers to Dachau, for example. Now, and she talks about the liberation of Dachau sort of somewhere around page 213 and 214. And our heroine, they're not there. This is not their story, but somehow, I presume she feels, by referring over to the grand story of the horrific story of the Shoah and the main part of the Shoah of Dachau, somehow she's linking this story into something all the more significant. And I don't think it helps her cause. I think the story is an amazing story. I think under a better author will have made so much more of the material. And I really wanted to know about the women. So at the end of the day, I did find it a little bit disappointing, and hope that someone will actually pick up the story and maybe rewrite it in a perhaps more conventional way in terms of narrative, and we will get to know the individuals involved. And strangely, what will stay in my memory is the effect, not of the text of the book, because the effect of the text of the book, I think, is weak, given what it could have been. But what will linger in my memory is the effect of there being a book at all, because the existence of the book brings them all back together again and allows them to tell their story, which I'm so grateful for. So I'm grateful to the author for writing the book, to bring them back together, and now allowing me to find out that there is such a story. A bit resentful that she doesn't pull it off in the way that I was rather hoping. And maybe there's someone out there who feels that they could pick up this story and make a far better job of it. So I'll leave it there, because I think I've annoyed a few people already, and pass back over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much. I don't think any of us are annoyed, and certainly we understand what you're saying. As I usually try and do, to try and get things opened up, I have given some thought to a couple of things. And what I wanted to just refer to, if I can find my thing, where's it gone? Here we are. I saw a report in The Guardian about the book, and quoting what it says in The Guardian, the nine had to count on each other to survive, and that bond was something they would find hard to replicate later in normal life. The intensity of their friendships was an essential part of their experience. We're told that they searched for families or loved ones that they had left behind, suffered nightmares, and found relationships hard. 6 of the 9 married other survivors, but the group scattered and mostly did not stay in contact until 60 years later, when they came together and finally talked about their escape. Clearly, this powerful book reunites them. You would have thought that their survival together would have bonded them closely, really, for the rest of their lives. But perhaps escaping from having to think about that tortured existence was more important. So I don't know what others think the reasons would have been, and you know, what is your view, Michael?
Well, when I saw that quote as well, the idea that people who live remarkable lives, even for this, the narrative period of the book is quite short, but people who live remarkable lives find it very difficult to return to the unremarkable, and the lives that they're being asked to return to aren't a refuge from the horror. They're just so mundane, so trivial, that it's very difficult to be part of. And that did resonate with me, not in the sense that I've ever done anything remarkable, but in the sense that my family survivors just had a disdain for ordinary life, and couldn't understand the things that used to worry us and were causes of concern. Given that they'd acted on a far greater stage, they could find no meaning in the next, I don't know, the case of my relatives, in the next 50 years of their lives, which is obviously a tragedy that compounds the original tragedy. So that's what I thought that was a really interesting point made in The Guardian. Yeah. I'm just sort of wondering whether, on the first point that I make, what people feel about, you know, is a book about the Holocaust, which doesn't talk about Jews, is that a book about the Holocaust, or is it just a book about the Second World War, and whether that makes any difference? It's something that's in my mind very often when I read these books.
Does anybody have any comment either on the point I raised or the question Michael just raised, or have any other questions? And if so, please unmute yourself. Richard?
If I may.
Yeah.
Good evening. I think that if you look at the hierarchy of the types of people that the Nazis hated, the Jews were very much in a class of their own, the Untermenschen. And, you know, Hitler couldn't last for 5 minutes without mentioning his hatred of the Jews, going back to the 1920s. So the Holocaust was very much Jewish-centric, if you like, but there were many, many other victims, the Slavs, the Gypsies and the Roma, the communists, anybody who opposed Hitler politically, psychologically, industrially, and obviously in the countries that were occupied, you had the resistance forces as well. So, and you know, they weren't treated like ordinary POWs, they were executed. So the Holocaust was certainly Jewish-centric, but by no means the Jews were the only victims.
But are we comfortable when persecuted peoples around the world these days invoke the Holocaust? And you see there's a sensitivity to it, that the Holocaust was qualitatively more awful than anything else. And therefore you have no right to invoke our Holocaust to talk about what is just perhaps an ordinary persecution. And you see Jewish people responding in that way. I have to say that that's where I was once, but I'm very comfortable now. So Richard, I'm afraid I do disagree with you. I just think it's all part of the ability of human beings to hurt each other and to behave appallingly. And there may be a division, by a quantitative division, but I don't think the Holocaust should be set aside as something uniquely different, and you can't compare anything else to the Holocaust. And anyone invoking the Holocaust I agree, sometimes invoking the Holocaust is done in a very trivial and annoying manner, but in principle, all persecution is on the same spectrum as the Holocaust.
Yeah, well, as we're all very well aware now, a lot of so-called anti-Zionists go on about the Israeli Holocaust against the Palestinians, which is extremely offensive, let's face it, because it's not true. And they trivialize the Holocaust, and a lot of people these days, a lot of anti-Semites, or who they call themselves anti-Zionists, we all know what that means, they do tend to trivialize the Nazi Holocaust when they compare other types of prejudices to what happened to the Jews. But can I just go back to your initial points, Michael, about what's going on in Ukraine? What's going on in Ukraine is absolutely disgusting, and Putin is acting like a mirror image of Hitler. Although Putin per se is not an anti-Semite as such, but he appears to be anti everything else. But we mustn't forget the fact that when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, there was a vacuum between the time that they invaded and the time that their armies actually went into the Baltic areas and the western part of the Soviet Union. And during that period, the nationalists in the Baltic countries, and especially in Ukraine, had a bit of a field day against the Jews. There are some really infamous incidences. There's the famous or infamous incidents in the garage in Ukraine, where they clubbed to death Jews. And then obviously later on in the war, you had Babi Yar as well. I know we're not here to talk about that per se, but you can understand why older Jewish people have their concerns about Ukraine. But that was 80 years ago. And I don't think, in all honesty, that despite the fact that a lot of Ukrainians, older people, are still very nationalistic and very much involved in the church over there to this day, I think the younger people are more enlightened. And after all, remember, the president is Jewish as well, and he's openly Jewish. I think the prime minister is Jewish as well. So, one would hope that the younger generation is more enlightened towards the Jews. And, I agree with you, Michael, that we shouldn't judge Ukrainians by what happened 80 years ago.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can I just jump in here? Michael, at the very beginning, you raised a point which was not really related to the book, or indeed really to the Ukrainian situation now, but more general point about whether one is responsible for one's national history. I just want to explore that a little bit further with you, and to say that one, in some ways, I agree with your general thesis. I think they may be relevant to the future, if not to the history. So one is responsible for the future of one's country, if not for the history of it. So I'll give you the example of Germany and Austria. Germany is a country which, to my mind, has come to terms with its past, addressed its faults, and tried to make remedy as best it can, maybe not perfectly. So the youth of Germany today, I think, are alert to their historical legacy and have made every effort to come to terms with it and to behave in a better way. In contrast, for example, to Austria. Austria has, to my mind, and my knowledge is limited, but my perception is that Austria has chosen to ignore its history, blame others, never come to terms with it, and just wish the history had gone away. So I think if one's responsible for one's national history, or not in the case, I mean, you are responsible for your national future, and the decisions that you make today and tomorrow will determine how that history plays out.
Yeah, I accept your distinction between the Germans, who I think have made more than reasonable effort, and the Austrians who've just hoped it would go away, and it keeps on not going away for them. But in terms of sort of our seeing the world through only national eyes, my concern is, as Jews, do we see persecution as our private property? That, you know, we are the most persecuted, so don't talk to me about persecution. We know all about it, and I think that it's a very unhealthy worldview. I think it's a worldview that's in the UK at the moment, for one reason or another, we're embracing. I don't know if you've got a chance to read David Baddiel's book, which I just didn't seem to me to be talking about anything, any world that I've inhabited. But it seems to be an attempt to nationalize suffering on behalf of the Jewish people. And I think this book, better written, would have helped us understand there's lots more suffering in the world, and lots more suffering in that moment of Jewish suffering. There were many other people suffering, and we should try and resist the attempt to nationalize suffering.
Well, I agree with you. I agree with you. And I think it's, as I say, going back to my earlier point, it's really what you do now and determines the future. So, for example, as Simon will know, in our own community, we have paid attention and tried to take some effective action, which we're in the course of implementing, in relation to the treatment of the Uyghurs in China, which is a non-Jewish cause, a Muslim cause, if anything, rather than purely nationalistic. So we are trying to take a greater breadth of view of world problems and to see suffering elsewhere as part of our suffering, which we can and should be doing something about.
Yeah, I very much agree with you.
Certainly, in terms of the Yad Vashem attitude, they certainly do not take the view that other genocides are not relevant or of any issue. Their view simply is that their focus is on the Holocaust, the Jewish genocide, where Professor Yehuda Bauer does draw one distinction, which is at that time there was no Jewish country. It wasn't like other examples of genocide in particular countries involved of wiping out the entire population or attempting to. In our case, we didn't even have a country. It was merely our race that was to be wiped out. But yes, there's no to suggest that we have no concern for other genocides or persecution. It is and should be a nonsense.
Right. I'd like to ask people how they feel about my takeaway from the book, that she doesn't do full honor to the nine. We don't get to know about them enough, and I'm rather hoping that someone else will rewrite the story. Now, I do know that in this book club, people come along not having read the book in the hope of finding out whether they need to read the book. So is there anyone out there who's even part read the book, who feel that the account of the women was adequate and they did feel that they understood the women on an individual basis?
I'm certainly prepared to talk on this, but I'm rather hoping others will first.
I don't know how to put my hand up, but can you hear me?
We can
yes,
hear
you perfectly well.
Yeah, I almost finished the book, and I thought it was my lack of concentration at the beginning, in that I felt it was very disjointed. And in the same way, I would be reading about one of the women, but then I really wasn't learning anything about her. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe the author didn't have enough information, but I find when you get about halfway through, when you get more into their journey, when they've left the camp or they've escaped, it becomes much more about them as a group, not necessarily as individuals, which I found very interesting, and how they depend on each other, how they work together. And then later learning things I hadn't known about how badly women were affected afterwards, raping and other instances, and how they weren't allowed to talk about it in a way that, oh, sorry, I'm not being very clear, but it just introduced a different side of the effects of war to me that I hadn't sort of thought about. And how do you get back to normal life? And obviously they don't get back to normal life, but how do you find your family, those sorts of things. So I found from that point of view, I found that very interesting. And it might not fit in what we term as Holocaust literature, but it was, I think, helpful to see things that happen to other people, not just us, especially say what's going on in Ukraine at the moment as well.
I agree with you so much that some of the material, particularly at the end, was interesting, but I felt it missed out because I didn't really know the people. I didn't know the nine, and it was a missed opportunity, I think, to have a better insight in what it is to be a human being under those circumstances. If we understood the human beings who were under it, rather than I was finding I was flipping back to try and remember who on earth that person was, and when they came into the story, and do I know anything else about them? And I didn't seem to know anything else about them, so that was a little bit frustrating. But yeah, Ruth, I do agree with you. The stuff about, you know, the stuff about women in particular, I think was very important. I can only assume that there is a major literature out there about women, particularly in the Holocaust and during war. Is there such a thing?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
I agree, and one of the comments I read from a journalist that had done a review said that the story of women's resistance during World War II needs to be told, and the Nine accomplishes this in spades. So women's resistance, particularly Jewish women's resistance during World War II, is of course a big subject. It's also the case that they bore a greater responsibility for their families than the men. Often the men were left, the women were left looking after the children and elderly parents on the basis that the adult men were perceived initially as being the prime targets, and therefore they left first, unwittingly, leaving the women with the prime responsibility. And there's much been written on that, and the heroism of women in the Holocaust is a huge subject, because they were in many cases very landed in it, and often saved those few survivors who were saved by the mothers rejecting them, as is the tale of Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, the main principal of Yad Vashem, who survived literally as his mother absolutely rejected him because she knew what was going on. She had to be with the younger ones, and he could survive, and he did. I don't know if anyone has any other more views on this.
On the issue, there's a remarkable halachic approach to the women coming out of the camps. There's a very ugly bit of halakha that I'm personally not that proud of, but it's nonetheless a problem. That a woman involved in an adulterous affair can't go back to her husband, but if it was rape, then we're obviously very sympathetic. However, if the husband is a kohen, is a priest, then even a woman who's been raped can't go back to her husband. And I think at some point in 1945, someone realized this was potentially a huge problem, particularly for the Hungarian women who were the last in, coming out of Auschwitz. You know, what are we going to do? Do we now have to interview them all and say, you know, exactly what happened to you, and is your husband a kohen? It would have been absolutely awful. And remarkably, the rabbi who dealt with this was later to become one of the most stringent authorities who became the head of the Bet Din in Manchester and then in Yerushalayim, someone called Diane Weiss. He said it's obvious that there's no problem, because if you look at the rules for guards in concentration camps, they're not allowed to have sexual relations with non-Aryan women. Therefore, they didn't have sexual relations with non-Aryan women. Therefore, we don't have a problem. So it was a moment of rabbinic sense, which I concede is not always something that is evident. But they avoided something potentially awful by coming up with that legal fiction that nothing ever happened in the camps to the women, although of course we understand that that's not the reality. But it was interesting how they used the legal fiction to avoid something far worse than that. So.
Good to hear that common sense prevailed.
Yeah, that was the last time, however. It was, so that's sort of 77 years ago.
Well,
Simon, you had a second point. I think I disturbed you.
I'm sorry to say that I did actually raise that second point, which was everything to do with the role of women in the Holocaust. On the subject of what you just gave that example, it is interesting though, in halacha, in Jewish law, there are situations, the expression mipnei darchei shalom, in pursuit for the cause of pursuing peace, theoretically one wouldn't be allowed to save the life of a non-Jewish person if it meant you were to desecrate the Shabbat, the Sabbath, but actually mipnei darchei shalom, for the pursuit of peace, we can. So the concept of actually being guilty of something for that purpose does exist. So I would assume, on the example you just gave, such a logic would have prevailed in their coming up with that legal fiction, because for the sake of peace and much more damning, terrible consequences.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't invoke that principle too much anymore, and it's definitely missing from the rabbinic toolkit for the moment, and hopefully one of the leading rabbis will rediscover it. And for example, it should have been used to solve Agunai, for example, but
yes,
it wasn't.
Yeah.
It was. I'll tell you where it was used. Were the Agunot after 9/11. After 9/11.
Is everyone familiar with what Agunai is? I think perhaps you should just explain.
Right. So a woman whose husband dies can obviously remarry, but we need evidence of the death of the husband, or we need evidence of a divorce. So there's one aspect of Agunai, which is a recalcitrant husband. That's not the topic that this is about. That if a husband disappears and we don't have evidence of his death, and don't forget that the halacha was framed, say, from the years 500 to 1500. There was no instances of bodies being obliterated in a massive explosion. So the idea that someone would die and there'd be no evidence was very difficult to get around. So there were 30 women who had lost their husbands, but there was no physical evidence that would have met the bar of evidential requirement as far as the halacha is concerned. And it's very interesting how, again, in a moment of crisis, a rabbi did step forward. And so of the 30, one was a Sephardi, and the Sephardim deal with these things a lot more slickly than Ashkenazim. That was dealt with. One was a Belzer Chassid, and the Belzer Rebbe davened and it was fine. So that finished, which left a number of Ashkenazi non-Hasidic women with a problem. So one of the foremost rabbis in Yerushalayim said, I'm going to sort this out. I don't know quite how I sort this out, but I'm going to sort it out. Tell the women when they're ready, they can definitely get married again. And he invoked all sorts of common sense understandings. So he found that one husband had a routine that every morning he bought his New York Times, having got off the subway, bought his New York Times, went to Starbucks, bought a coffee, went to his office, phoned his wife, and then sat down to work. He'd done all of those things that morning, but there was no evidence of a dead body. And the general feeling was, look, common sense. He's bought his coffee, he's bought his newspaper, he's bought his Starbucks, he's phoned his wife. He was in that building when it went up in smoke. So the wife, when she's ready, can remarry. They also found the fabric of one gentleman's trousers. So in halakha, that's maybe not all that good, because maybe he swapped trousers with someone else. And the rabbis wisely pointed out that the kind of people who were caught in this nightmare were unlikely to be swapping trousers at 9 o'clock in the morning. So we can see evidence of the fabric is evidence that he was there. It was certainly from my perspective, a moment of amazing halachic creativity, as was the response to the Shoah, a moment of halachic creativity. It would be sad to think that we only have those moments of creativity when the chips are down and people are suffering terribly. But yes, I don't know if that helps. So if indeed that this book club is true to its own traditions, that people come along to read it, I fear that this may be the only book on the subject, in which case you've got to read it because you've got to know about what happened to these women. If you want to gamble that someone indeed is going to write a better book, then gamble away, but you may lose out on what is absolutely a remarkable story. So that's my takeaway bit of advice.
Can I just chip in very quickly? I bought the book, but I haven't read it yet, so I'm at a disadvantage. The only other book that I've read about women in the war was from the completely different standpoint of German women in Berlin when the Russians came in 1945 and the way they were treated. And it's a book written anonymously. It's just called A Woman in Berlin. And they don't know definitely who wrote it, but it's a story of the German civilian women and the attacks, the brutal attacks of the Russians when they took Berlin. And that was a harrowing and brutal book with obviously a different perspective.
Right. Yeah.
Just as a matter of information, since you brought up the subject of Agunai, in the Israeli army, there is a practice that all soldiers declare, I think it is divorce, in the event of their body not being found, so that Agunai should not apply in the event that they go missing and no trace. So that they do come up with a formula to make that not a problem. In that
Would you be amazed if I told you I could find you a load of rabbis who don't accept the validity of that?
Oh God, how sad. Yeah.
Can I ask a question, Michael? Is there a process, and by the sound of it, there isn't, as there is in English law, when people disappear, you can go to the courts for a declaration after 7 years and they be presumed dead, which allows people to be married, do all sorts of things like that. There's no such similar practice.
We do have such a process, and that was introduced in the 19th century because for the first time it was felt that no, you can't go missing all that easily. And the rabbinic responsum, which was written then by someone called Chatam Sofer, Moshe Sofer of Pressburg, he said, these days we have newspapers, we have post office, we have the mail. If you look for someone and they're not going to be able to hide. And obviously the technology of hiding wasn't all that well developed. So we now take it that if someone disappears for long enough, and you'll forgive me, I can't remember whether it is as much as 7 years, but there comes a point where we assume that they're dead. But as I said to Simon, I will then be able to find you a number of rabbis who won't validate that decision, unfortunately.
Yeah, shocking. I'm very conscious, Michael, that I know you're supposed to be giving Daf Yomi, and that you therefore need to leave slightly before 9 o'clock. If there aren't any other questions, I do want to mention what our next book club event is going to be on and when it's going to be. But just before I do that, does anybody have any further questions they'd like to ask Michael or raise for discussion? That sounds like silence, allowing time for unmuting. So the book that we're going to be discussing for our next book club event is a book called The Fiddle by Natalie Cumming. And we have got Natalie Cumming to be attending to facilitate discussion, and it's taking place on the 11th of May. Invitations are going to be sent out, Sophie, I think I'm right in saying, tomorrow.
Yeah.
The link to enable the purchase of the book. Yes, so
she's a very interesting speaker. I've seen her recently. She's really good.
Oh, good. I didn't know that. The final thing is to say, as always, a huge thank you to you, Michael. You are, and I believe we'd all agree, you are absolutely superb the way you draw attention to everything, including healthy criticism, which I can remember certain books, perhaps it was The Tattooist of Auschwitz, where you completely, excuse my, crucified the author as being useless. Heather Morris, I think it is. Anyway, so thank you all very, very much. Look forward to seeing you at the next book club event on the 11th of May.
Thank you.